we are live. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Scribe himself. And joining us today is an individual making their official debut here on the show. Now, in a career spanning more than 25 years, this guest has launched hundreds of new products, ranging from medical devices to virtual healthcare systems, non-dairy consumer cheese, next-generation alternatives, to the dreaded cone of shame for pets, and many more. He is a graduate of both the University of Wisconsin and the University of Minnesota, and he has completed postgraduate studies at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His formal training has been invaluable, but he credits this success to growing up in a family of artists, immigrants, and entrepreneurs. They taught him how to observe the world, see patterns before others notice them, and use those insights to create innovations. History is my guest's favorite way to observe the world. He believes the people from the past have plenty to teach us about the challenges and opportunities we face today. And in today's interview, we'll be talking about our guest's latest book, which is on a topic which is very fascinating to me, which I cannot wait to dive in. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, Mr. Jason Voiovich. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I am really excited to be here, Gabriel. Thank you.
No problem, Jason. So before we dive into your book, is there anything else you'd like to add about your background?
I think what's interesting about growing up in a family like I did with, people who are immigrants or entrepreneurs, inventors, is that I grew up thinking that was normal. When I went to college and when I graduated and when I went out into the world, I met people who were lawyers and accountants and engineers and all sorts of other people who thought that going to work 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, taking a couple of weeks of vacation was just, they thought that was normal. I thought that was strange. I thought that starting up a new business and coming up with a new product and doing an art project, that's what most people did. It actually took me a while into my 20s to figure out that is not what most people consider normal. So I think I bring a unique perspective to writing about history from someone who actually does it, rather than someone who goes back and studies it. And there's a plus and a minus to both of those approaches, but I certainly take a practitioner's approach to studying innovation history.
Excellent. And speaking of history, I understand that you have a book that is out, and the topic is incredible. So would you like to share with our viewers and listeners a little teaser into this book of yours and what we can expect?
The book just came out today, so we're recording this on May 13th, 2025. That is release day for Bullfrogs, Bingo, and The Little House on the Prairie, How Innovators of the Great Depression Made the Best of the Worst of Times. And no, I did not time it to be exactly as well or poorly timed as it is. But in short, the book is a sort of tapas approach to telling the stories about the Great Depression. It has 21 stories of how everyday people turned lemons into lemonade. And it wasn't just that they survived hardships. They created many of the products, services, entertainment, and ideas that we still enjoy today. And although the Great Depression was a very painful time in American life, there's no question about that, it did also dramatically accelerate innovation. In short, a necessity is the mother of invention, right? And that's what we learned about during the Great Depression.
Absolutely, 100%. And it is really true. When you look at the Depression, there's a lot of unknown stories that really don't get shared as much, which is quite unfortunate. One story in particular that I found very fascinating in my own research, which of course the what was it officially called? It was the rebridling program for the United States Army. After the Great War, you had all of these horses that were used in the United States cavalry regiments. But of course, as time went on, cavalry seemed to just, fade away. So what do you do with all of these horses from the war? Well, you rebridle them and give them to ranches to sire new horses, new studs, new mares. And upon my research, I realized that a majority of horses from the 50s and 60s who have competed in the Derby, and I could be wrong, a majority of them, their ancestry ties back to these horses that were predominantly used in cavalry charges for the United States Cavalry Regiment. And that was fascinating. I did not know that about that aspect during the Great Depression. But as you said, there's a whole bunch of stuff we don't know about the Depression in terms of innovation and the innovators.
Well, let's continue that on horses for just a little bit. What's interesting about horses in that era, and really in the 1920s, moving into the 1930s, if you look at photos, for instance, of New York City in maybe around 1910, 1912, it's all horses with one car.
Yes.
And 10 years later, so late 1920s, early 1930s, it's full of cars with one very terrified horse in the picture. And you can look up this photo. It is really striking how fast that happened. Well, most people think that's a story about cars, and it certainly is a story about automobiles and how they took over American cities. But what's more interesting to me is what it meant to the people, what it meant to the horses and all the veterinarians who used to service the horses.
Mm-hmm.
Think about what happened to vets, and I was able to dig into some really fascinating primary source research from Cornell University that they archived. And it's all about how they needed to reteach veterinarians how to service dogs and cats, which were becoming more popular because if you were a vet in 1935 and you served horses, you were out of work. So all of those vets that were basically city-based vets who were large animal vets, basically, they were more like mechanics for cars because that's the way people got around. They all had to figure out how to be a vet for a dog or a cat. There was no such thing. No one did research on that. So the veterinary schools didn't teach it. They didn't know what dogs or cats were supposed to eat other than whatever they got from the table or whatever they could catch outside. They didn't know how to treat them, but veterinarians of that era invented the modern vet office, where when you walk in, they have one area for dogs, one area for cats, and they had individual waiting rooms. And what's most interesting and most fascinating about that is if you think, okay, well, that's neat. That's kind of the vet office that we go to today. That's also the clinical office you go to today to go to the clinic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Doctors learned it from the vets. The doctors, the modern medical office follows the modern veterinary office because doctors looked at what vets were doing at that time and said, people are coming in because we have some of the first functional antibiotics. The sulfa drugs were the first ones. We actually have something that works. People were coming into the doctor's office because they had to get the prescription after the FDA was formalized and passed later in the decade. And so you went to the doctor. Before that, the doctor came to you.
Yes.
So this, in just the whole deal, that it all ties back to horses that no longer had a job anymore in cavalry or in the city transporting people, led to, in kind of quick succession, with a logical chain of events, all the way to this is where you go to your doctor's office. All that comes back to a horse that didn't have a job anymore.
Fascinating. And see, it's these little tidbits in history that are incredible that, paint a picture. And speaking of history, as read in your bio, you love telling these stories through the lens of history. So throughout your career, this wide-spanning career, what sort of pushed you to approach this book through the lens of history? Were you always fascinated with history growing up, or did this come later in life?
I've always been fascinated with history. My parents and grandparents were avid readers, storytellers, historians in their own right. But initially, I wasn't interested in the Great Depression. It wasn't an era of history I found particularly fascinating earlier in my career. I just didn't know enough about it. But when I wrote my first book on presidential history, I was much more interested in that sort of history earlier in my career. So I wrote a book called Marketer in Chief, and that tracked the kind of how the changing role of the chief executive as a chief marketing officer for the United States. And I got to presidents Coolidge, Hoover, uh, Roosevelt, kind of that era. And I knew what most people knew about FDR. And I knew even less about Hoover, and I knew even less about Calvin Coolidge, almost nothing about Warren G. Harding. But when I looked into that era, it blew me away how much of my own career as an innovator dates back to the 1920s. So I wrote a book, Booze, Babe, and the Little Black Dress, which is all about the Roaring 20s. And as I was writing that book and finishing that book in 2023, it became crystal clear that it really wasn't just about the 20s. I needed to follow that up with a book about the Great Depression and how that changed things. And its follow-up, God willing, a couple years from now, on the 1940s as a capstone to that 30-year era. So in short, it wasn't like I think most things, it was a happy accident. That the more I learned about something, the more fascinating it became. And it became fascinating because as a curious person, I love things that don't get talked about that often, and I want to know why. And I think right now, with everything that's going on in the world, I think that's an era of history we could learn more about and we could take some good lessons from.
I couldn't agree more, Jason, because it is true. If you look at from the 20s, 30s, and the 40s, there is this history that you can explore, not just, the history of, America falling down and then slowly building itself back up to be a superpower. But you can look at, well, what are the innovations that came out from the 20s and the 30s that we have now? And one thing that I remember using a media example is the film TV show 1923, which is a phenomenal show, viewers and listeners, but that is besides the point. But there is a scene where the main characters and their families go into Main Street and they see the changes of what's happening. Now, mind you, Montana is furthest away from the great cities like Chicago and New York and many more. But you do see inventions and a change to their way of life. It's almost like a blend of the old West 1870s, 1890s with the modern era, especially with the arrival of appliances from refrigerators, laundry machines, and stuff like that. It is just insane. And then how people paid for these, how they organize, selling these things. It's just incredible. So ultimately, that leads me to wonder, like, how crazy was it? Because at that time, it would be like you were seen as a millionaire if you had those machines, whereas now it's just a common item. So for you, Jason, when you began writing this book and drafting the idea, what would you consider the aha moment, in the sense that you've been very passionate about completing this story and wanting to expand on it?
I think the biggest thing that struck me was the transition that happened during that 30-year period in our day-to-day lives. If I were to take us back in a time machine and we went back to 1910, most of us would find the world we lived in utterly unrecognizable. We wouldn't be able to get around. We wouldn't know how to get from place to place. Like, there are many people who still ride the trains, of course, out on the East Coast, but it's not a requirement like it was then. We wouldn't know how to mount a horse. Most people don't. Even where we got our food, how we heated our homes. There's no electricity in most places. All of those things, utterly unrecognizable world. I take you back. We instead of going back to 1910, we go back to 1930, for instance. either, anywhere between 1925 and 1935, we might be a little like, okay, we don't quite have our bearings, but we'd be able to get around. We'd get in a car to drive around. We'd have a home probably in the suburbs. There's electricity. We've got a dog or a cat at home. We send our kids to a centralized school. All the things, we have frozen food. We have a refrigerator. We've got a radio. Some of us might even have a TV, maybe not, but the radio is the same sort of thing. There's a huge media environment around that is strikingly similar to what we have today, just with different technology. So within about a half an hour, we would be pretty well suited to that world. That amount of change in that short a period of time has very rarely happened. People think about the internet era in the 1990s. I certainly grew up through seeing the transition of the internet era. I thought that was a big deal. And to answer your question more directly, I thought the biggest change was the information revolution. I thought that was really the biggest deal. And before that, it might have been the Industrial Revolution or the Agricultural Revolution, something like that. But what I learned was the revolution I was not taught about in school was the consumer revolution of the 1920s and 30s. And once I learned that, I thought, okay, this is the one that probably changed most people's day-to-day lives even more than the information revolution did at the end of this century. Right. That changed how we got information, but that's about it. It didn't change really every aspect of our lives like the 1920s did.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the consumer revolution, because that is a period that we really don't talk about as much. And I remember seeing a lot of documentaries on that, like the food that built America or the companies that have built America and stuff like that, and seeing how these inventions, these creations, gradually over time change the way we approach everyday life. One thing I found very fascinating was, of course, the creation of candy, which most people think, well, how does candy play into the overall role of history? If you look at it in a case of M&Ms, of course, we have to go back to Hershey's chocolate, because that was the first confections chocolate plant at that time. But eventually, you have other companies trying to figure out what can we do to really tap into the market. Because a little hint of your listeners, sweets were not a very popular thing as we think of them now. There was like an abundance of candy. No, there wasn't. It was like a very, very limited aspect of American consumer life. It was like a little tree. It was like, oh, if you did something good, you got a little piece of chocolate. And it's just so fascinating. And ultimately, this leads to another question, Jason, I have for you. So after you decided on telling this story, the story of the 30s, what was sort of the goal that you had going into this as the author, but also the promise you're making to your future readers?
It's a very good question. Whenever you're looking to tell a story, one of the first things you need to think about is, has that story been told before? And am I telling a story in a new way with a new message? It's not enough to tell it just in a new way. Are you telling it in a new way that is important, relevant, timely, and missing from the dialogue right now? And when I did my research and really read everything I could find on the 1930s, it was, whether fiction or nonfiction, what you come away with really quickly is the Great Depression sort of tells that it's in the name. It's the Great Depression. Every single story is tinged with this kind of negativity and this doom and this gloom about it. And that's not to say that those things weren't true or that wasn't an accurate representation of that era. But what gets lost when you start with that premise is you're not looking for anything positive. Even the positive things get turned into a negative light. For instance, you mentioned candy before.
Mhm.
Even the stories about candy get turned negative. And here's how. Is that, well, people were so hungry that they bought candy bars because candy bars were a very cheap source of calories and they were an alternative to starvation. Oh, come on. I mean, really? And that's when we, innovators, creative people like me, like many people who are listening, don't see the world that way.
Mm.
We certainly see there are challenges, but when we see challenges, we think, how can we make something out of that? How can we, make lemonade out of lemons? And we look at it from a positive perspective. And what I learned out there was that no one was doing that. No one was taking that kind of perspective. No one was showing people how a very difficult time created much of the modern world we enjoy today. Yes, it was painful, but there was an upside to it. That is not denying the negativity. It's just giving people another perspective. I think that's relevant right now because when we see stressful times, when we see tariffs, when we see international conflict, we tend to think, well, we are so conditioned now that everything has to be great. And, if these aren't good times, then there's nothing to be gained from that. And we want all positive all the time. Well, the reality is, as adults, we realize that, there are times that are difficult to get through, and we need to find a way to get through them, not just make it through, but thrive our way through them. The Great Depression shows us how to do that. Our grandparents, mostly average, everyday people, figured out a way to do it. The lessons they can teach us can apply to us today as we're thinking about how do we continue to recover from the pandemic? How do we make up for lost time that kids have lost in school? How do we address, social problems, racial problems, gender problems? How do we deal with all these things? How do we deal with climate change? How do we address international conflict? Our grandparents figured this out. They worked through all these things. They came up with really novel solutions. We can too. That's the message and the promise of this book. This will be the most positive history book you read, and it's about the most depressing period in American history. That's my promise.
Interesting. That's a very interesting premise to look at, the depression, because when we think of that, we don't really think of, the positive aspect of probably one of the worst situations in the early 20th century for the United States. And I'm wondering, after you began drafting this and you finished the first draft, Jason, when people learned about this, friends and family, and you shared it with them, what was their reaction like? And did they get that message across?
Yeah, it was an interesting. I had a number of early readers mixing from family and friends, of course, to professional historians, to high school teachers, all manner of different folks who read early drafts of the book. What was most interesting about them, even people who were really well read, had read as much or more history than I have, were surprised and had never heard of. There are 21 stories in the book, and my early readers had maybe been familiar with 3 or 4 of them. Most of the stories in the book were completely unknown and not told. And that strikes me as we have a major gap in our collective understanding of that era. And I think it is, in the United States, we treat it as almost this totem that we kind of hearken back to, like, well, we don't want it to be like the Great Depression. Or, boy, we'll go right back. We do these tariffs, it'll be right back to the Great Depression. And, oh, we're going to have another Great Depression. Where I think most people don't really realize, they don't understand that much about the era they're talking about. And they have a very one-dimensional view of what that is. And my early readers got the message right away. One of the readers that was most interesting to me was a high school teacher, retired high school teacher out of Texas, who his feedback in an email to me after he finished reading was, Gen Z needs to read this, period. There's so much kind of doom and gloom out there. There's so much negativity just floating around. We need histories that tell this kind of positive, uplifting, energetic story. It's not to say that denigrates or makes unreal or invalidates any of the difficult suffering that people had. Not at all. Not at all. Those are all still valuable histories. But when that's all the history you get, you start to lose a little perspective on, okay, well, gosh, we enjoy a lot of great things today. Where did those come from? If things were so terrible in the past, it was just unrelentingly awful, how is it that we're doing so great today? Something must have happened. Something must have come together to make that work. Those are the stories I tell.
Absolutely. And this kind of leads into another question, first of many reflective questions. And the first question is, Jason, so going back to your first book, which was written about the Roaring 20s and the story you want to tell with the 20s as sort of like a character in of itself, besides the setting. When we write our first book, we do have this nervousness if people are going to accept it, especially if it's about history. And especially in today's digital age, it's a hit or a miss. Well, not a hit or a miss. It's a double-edged sword, because on one side, you will find people who are interested, who are very open-minded. On the other side, unfortunately, you will leave yourself exposed to a lot of critiques, harsh comments, negativity, spam, trolling, etc. And that can be very detrimental to a person's overall mental health, their well-being, and make them reconsider pursuing anything further beyond their first book. And of course, imposter syndrome is always going in the back of everyone's mind. I don't care who you are, it's always going to be there. So I'm curious, Jason, from your first book, did you have those moments of heightened anxiety or imposter syndrome? And if so, what disciplined you to continue with the next book, which is the book we're talking about now, to also potentially the third in this trilogy, which we'll be talking about the 1940s?
I think I am privileged and unique in a way that my upbringing prepared me for negativity in a way most people's doesn't. When you are an inventor, a creative person, an innovator, and you're getting things out there, you're launching new businesses, you are inventing new products, failure is a part of your life. There's an old story that I learned from my mentors early on in my career, and from my parents and grandparents, and that I teach to my clients today, is say, if you launch 10 products, 6 of them will fail outright. And this is if you're good. 6 fail, 3 basically break even, and 1 is successful. And what we mean by successful is it was worth doing. You actually made a decent living. You probably didn't make up for the 9 others, but you did okay. And maybe 1 out of 100, you might get lucky in your career, or 1 out of 100 becomes kind of a runaway success, and it makes up for all the other ones. And that's the only one that people talk about. It's the only one that people care about. They don't see the other 99. They see the 1.
Mm.
So when, as often as I have failed in my career, and any innovator that tells you they have not failed in their career is lying to you, or selling something. For as often as it's happened, you realize that when people tell you no, or they have critics, my idol in that case is not only my parents and my upbringing, but Teddy Roosevelt, actually,
Mhm.
the man in the arena. Says, I remember that. I have that on my desk. The speech for the man in the arena. And if you're not familiar with it, listener, dear listener, look it up. You can hear it, on YouTube. And it basically says, hey, the person who is valued is the one who is in the arena doing the deed, getting beat up, sweaty, bloody, and because even if that person fails, they failed doing something. They didn't fail. No one built a statue to a critic.
Right.
And that's what I remember is anyone who's critiquing the work, critiques don't bother me. The only critiques I take seriously are from other innovators, other historians, other writers. I take their criticism to heart because they're usually the people who they're not trolling. That's not, their critiques are, and if you're listening, you might not be able to see this, but these are the two books. This is Booze Babe in the Little Black Dress and Bullfrogs Bingo in the Little House on the Prairie. If you'll notice, Booze Babe in the Little Black Dress is longer than the book in the 1930s. And it was feedback from professional historians that said, you can tighten it up. The story, like these stories are great, but you need to do a little bit more editing. Because the message should be tight. You don't need to go off on this tangent or that tangent. Put that up on your website. Have people read that if they want to. But for the person picking up the book, they need a tight, coherent story. You don't have to have everything in it.
Right.
And it's what gets edited out that's important. That's the kind of critique that makes sense to me and that I'll use. The person who says, hey, I read this chapter and you said this thing about this and that rubbed me the wrong way and now you're a bad person. You know what? I've been told a lot worse in my career. I've been thrown out of better places than that. So I'm not concerned. And I think the advice I usually give most writers is spend a month or two, get a temp job as a door-to-door salesperson. Sell something door-to-door or on the phone. You will get rejected so many times that it will build your muscles for that. You will learn how to mentally handle that sort of thing. So when someone says, I didn't really like the cover of your book, it doesn't even faze you anymore. And I think that part is really important. I think we've become, especially digitally now, we are very much immune. We're vulnerable to criticism in one way, and we're immune to it in another, where we're very vulnerable to someone online who we've never seen giving us that kind of criticism, but we haven't experienced it enough live. That sort of thing just doesn't bother me in the same way it bothers most people, because I have been rejected in a context of trying to sell my products and ideas so many times that it doesn't bother me the same way anymore. So that's a little different than most writers. I know most writers really struggle with that, and I sympathize with them. And when I speak with them, say, go out and sell something for a few months. Trust me, you will get over it, because you have to get over it. Otherwise, you won't put your ideas out there. That's worse, is not getting that told.
That is very true, Jason. That is very true. And this next question, I feel, is like kind of tailor-made to you, not just as a writer, but also as an innovator as well. And this question is this. So for context, a previous guest of mine on the show, Jasmine Young, posted on her socials, she's a fellow author, by the way, posted that we are in a golden age of independent creators. And she broke it down saying of authors, artists, musicians, businessmen and women, content creators, what have you. And upon really doing a self-reflection of myself, I realized that I was also part of this, as she said, golden age, because I began my writing career back in 2020 at the height of the pandemic and of the lockdown era. And as I've been asking my guests this question, I'm getting a lot of different answers to this. And some have said that we are in a renaissance of some kind. Some say that we are not in a golden age, but rather a new age of independent creators. And some have even gone forward and said that we are not in a golden age, we're not in a renaissance, we're not even in a new age, because while there is a lot more independently created things, whether that's music, books, arts, what have you, and even new businesses, a majority of those were not made with the right intentions, in the sense that they were passionate about it. They just wanted to get it out there. Now, for you, Jason, as both a writer, historian, and an innovator yourself, what are your thoughts on this question? Do you believe that we are in some kind of renaissance of creators, or we are on the verge of becoming a golden age?
In my mind, we have always been in a golden age of creativity. It's just a matter if we see it or not. And here's what I mean. When I was a kid in the early 1980s, we thought, well, we didn't have YouTube creators. We didn't have all these places where people could do all these things. But you know what? A lot of people I knew created new sports games. They created rollerblades in the 1980s. Kids in their basements played Dungeons and Dragons and created new fantasy worlds down there. There were so many different opportunities for creativity that people would put on. I remember my friends and I would put on plays and skits and stuff out in the park. And no, we didn't have we had camcorders. If people remember what a camcorder was, it was a big thing you kept on your, you had to put it on your shoulder. We made our own movies. We did all that kind of stuff. There's always creativity if you know where to look for it. And I think what some of the technologies have allowed us to do is they've lowered the barriers to entry for that. They've lowered the barriers to access to that sort of thing. But there's never a time when people weren't creative. We could go back to any time where it's more visible now. And I think that's what we're seeing. We are seeing it now, but it's always been there. It has absolutely always been there. And I think we need to take a look at it. We need to celebrate it and respect it. And I get it. It's very trendy to be negative. Journalists are negative. They tend to be. God bless you, journalists. I love you all, but you need to take an Adderall or something. Just a little bit more positivity is, would be useful. There's always been that kind of spark that we need to nurture, not only with young people. It's not just we need to support kids who want to do creative things. We need to support 20-year-olds who want to do creative things, and 30-year-olds who want to do creative things, and 80-year-olds who want to do creative things. This is what makes us human. And people talk a lot about this age of artificial intelligence and that the computers are smarter than us and the ChatGPT writes better than us. I think for most people it might. The point, though, is what makes humans different is our creativity. It is our birthright to innovate and to do new things. And to the extent to which these new technologies and this new approach will help show people and say, you can be creative, even if you don't think you are, you can be creative in your own way. That's what I want to celebrate. My books are all about average people who did this. Every once in a while, there's a Henry Ford kind of makes a cameo appearance. But usually it's people you've never heard of who found a way to get this done. I reject the notion that we need a TikTok, or we need some platform in order to be creative. It is our birthright. We have always been creative. We just haven't been looking, and we haven't been looking enough. And that's what we need to do.
Awesome. And that segues perfectly now into the business side of being an author, which I'm very eager to hear your thoughts on these questions, Jason. So, as an icebreaker question, when you began writing your books, did you have sort of an audience in mind? And the reason I bring this question up is, as authors, when we begin writing a book, we ourselves are the target audience because we know the story better than anyone else. I mean, we should. We're writing the thing in the first place, but when we go about publishing it, that's when we have to consider, okay, who exactly is going to read this book? What is the audience? What is the subcategory that this is going to fall under? So, did you have a good idea of your audience from your first book? And has it improved or changed with book 2? And as an add-on to that, in your opinion, when should a writer really take into account their audience? During the drafting phase, when the idea is still fresh, or in the marketing phase when the idea is finished and now they're able to switch off the writer's brain and now turn on the business brain?
Yeah, I think that I'll take your questions in reverse order.
Okay.
I'm more comfortable with helping people through the audience part and the kind of the invention part, or the creative part. I think there's a little bit of a myth that these things are sequential or that they are distinct. The audience and the author, whatever it is, the writing, the product, whatever it is, are co-created. And what I mean by that is, if it is just your creative work and no one reads it, that's not to say it's not valuable. It's just you haven't innovated. Invention is a creative act where you just kind of create something and it sits on a shelf and you created it. No one else has to appreciate it. It's just you. It was a creative act. To innovate, that requires a connection with an audience. So in order to to really have something, you need to that person needs to read, they need to buy, they need to adopt, they need to engage with you in some way. So in that process, the notion of what you're writing and who you're writing it for is iterative, and you're considering it all the time. Because if you wait to kind of create the book and then hope that you will find an audience for that book later, you may discover, and this happens all the time with inventors too, they create the invention with no thought of who it's going to be. They just want to create it. And then they go to find an audience for it. Great. You may discover that the audience has very different needs and wants than you originally created. And most of the time when you're done with the creative process and you've kind of switched, you don't want to go back and change the work. You don't want to edit it. You don't want to recast it. You're done with that part and you're shifting. And that becomes very frustrating for authors. I think the best thing an author can do is take more of an agile type approach, where what that means is you are learning and iterating all the time. So for me personally, as I'm writing different chapters and as I'm going through the process, it's why I have a Substack, Innovation History on Substack. And I have readers who I'm bouncing ideas off of throughout the process. Like, hey, I'm writing a book on the 1930s. What are the big things you're thinking of when you think of the 1930s? And I got early feedback on what people were thinking. Hey, I'm going to write a chapter about this. What do you know about that? What do you think about that? Hey, would you read this early draft of the chapter? And this is going in an iterative process. So by the time I'm ready to release a book, the audience has already given me a lot of feedback on it, and I can scale that up much more easily with a lot more confidence. To your second question, your first question though, is did I really have an idea of who the audience was? Sort of.
Mm.
And I think like most innovators, most creative people, you've got an idea, but that idea evolves and you're learning all the time. I think so many people believe that once they create an audience profile, that it's this set in stone thing.
Right.
Like, no, it's not. You are continually learning from your audience. Your audience is evolving as they go. Reading my first book gives people a lot of idea of what to expect from the second, right? So the audience for my first book doesn't think about me in the same way that same person thinks about me in the second book. They have a different set of expectations because they have experienced something. I have changed the audience by interacting with them. So you need to be in a continual mode of learning, discovery all the time. And the number one thing a historian can be, or a writer can be, the number one trait I find that makes a successful one versus an unsuccessful one is curiosity.
Mm.
Not only are you curious about your subject matter, you are curious about what your audience wants to hear from you and how they want to hear it from you. And I'm listening all the time and I'm working. That's why the second book is shorter than the first. It's some of the hardest feedback I got in the second one was removing full chapters from the book. I removed full chapters from the second book because my audience told me it doesn't fit. They knew my approach almost better than I did. They said, we know that this is what you're trying to communicate. That chapter doesn't fit. Get rid of it.
Absolutely. That is
It was
very true.
really cool. It was a great, it's not like they're writing along with me or they're giving me that kind of, it's not that. That's what a lot of authors are scared of is like, well, I don't want to co-write. You're not co-writing, you're co-creating.
That is very, very true. And this kind of leads into this next question, which I think you brought up earlier, Jason, which is, has this story been already told and does it, further contribute to the discussion? And as authors, we always find this tightrope to be very challenging in the sense that whenever we work on something, we want to showcase our individuality on the subject to show our knowledge. But in the meantime, we also want to give respect and honor the source material and the authors who have come before. Because specifically, if you write a fiction book, as an example, you want it to be creative and new with a fresh take, but you don't want it to be too new and too ambitious to where the audience is going to be completely lost in translation. But you also don't want it to be a rehash of something that has already been done before. So for you, Jason, how have you been able to balance these two aspects for both books?
I think the first thing to remember as a author and as a historian, as an innovator, is that you always stand on the shoulders of giants. That there are people that came before that I couldn't have written my history without relying on primary source materials and research that others have done. Yes, I've done a lot of my own primary source work, but I can't do every piece of primary source work. There are things that need to be done that come before, and you must honor that work, even if you don't agree with it. I think that perspective coming in really changes your approach to how you handle work. That even when there are pieces of work or scholarship that I think aren't quite hitting the mark, it is important to validate that perspective and really help treat it fairly and treat it with honor and dignity, even with your critique. You're not critiquing the person, you're critiquing the idea or the interpretation. And there, 100 years from now, someone will come back and critique mine in the same way. And I hope that they would honor my work in the same way. But I think you bring up something interesting about novelty and that concept. And there's an interesting little aspect of this from psychology that your readers can go and listeners can go look up. It's called the Wundt curve with the W. It's
Mm.
German. So WUNDT. And basically what it says visually is that people appreciate novelty and they really like it to a point. But there's a tipping point where it kind of starts to slide back down, where the more novel it is, the less people like it. And after a certain point, more novelty becomes decidedly negative.
Right.
So it's a balance strike, and I think you hit it properly, that it is a balance point. You want to be new enough, but not too new for your audience. And that's why building a relationship with your audience is so important over time, because, you know, like I said before, I have changed my audience by interacting with them. You know, my book on the 30s can address things that my book in the 20s really couldn't in the same way. I had to do less explanation, less exposition. My book on the 40s will need to do even less of that, but there are different challenges, right? As you move forward, you know, people are accustomed to certain things from you that kind of boxes you in a little bit too. As a fiction author, you can probably relate to that really well, that, you know, as you develop a character, the character can and cannot do certain things the further along you go. And many fiction authors talk about that. I would say the same thing applies to nonfiction authors who write series of different work. I think that's really important to continue to understand that you need to take a curious, long-term sort of approach to your audience, because if you are really innovating, meaning that you are creating something that your audience is going to adopt and be changed by, well, it's a dance. You know, it's a kind of a communal act that you're doing with your audience. It's a beautiful thing, but you need to pay attention to that and respect it.
That is very, very true, Jason. That is very, very true. And we're almost nearing the end of this incredible interview. So we have two last questions, which I think are two of the most important questions. So the second to last question I'm going to ask you is, which I think you will definitely agree on, is, you know, as writers, historians, and as innovators, you know, working alongside other people is a huge game changer. Networking is very, very critical. And especially for writers as well, because I'm sure you've probably read some journals or maybe watched some seminars where in the past, people have said that, oh, you know, being an author, being a writer is a one-man team. But that's not the case anymore. Or it's no longer been the case for the last few decades, where now people, especially independent creators, are realizing that if they want to succeed, they have to build their own team. And sometimes that's not very easy to do. They have to really dive deep into who they want to work with, whether that's, you know, getting a cover artist, finding an editor, finding a good group of people who can beta read the story and give you feedback before you give it to your editor. But with all that said, networking is vital. And I've learned that from my own experiences as a writer, that I don't think I would be where I am today had I not been networking with a lot of people and going through the hoops and hurdles. So in a two-part question, Jason, in your opinion, how important would you tell your fellow writers as well as clients that networking, no matter what industry they're in, is very important to not just their success, but also the product or services success? And also, are there any people you want to give a shout out to who have helped you along the way in your journey?
Yeah, I would say that how I think about it is, you know, the process of creating a book is kind of a three-part exercise in writing, publishing, and marketing. You know, the actual writing process of the book, the publishing, which is cover design, layout, all of those sorts of things, and marketing of the book, which is, you know, all of the promotional work. In each of those areas, usually has distinct networking and distinct kind of partners and people that you need to get to know. It is not about who you know, it is about who you get to know.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found that other writers and historians are very generous with their time, because we all know that all of us are smarter than any one of us.
Yes.
So uh, that's what I would say. When people, yes, it can be lonely. There are parts of it that need to be done all by yourself, but that's not true of most parts. There's so many different aspects of getting a book out into the world. A few notable places that I would say for writers, I've had really good luck with Atticus for formatting and publishing. That has been really, really useful. That has saved a lot of time this time around. Which has been useful. There are just so many people to thank. But I would say that, from a business perspective, one of the things I did with this book was created a series of courses and guidebooks that help people kind of connect the dots between the stories in the book and being an innovator themselves. They could say, oh, here are stories that came from the Great Depression. How do I make those real for my invention idea? I've actually worked to create a business around them, selling additional things. That's not what most, narrative nonfiction authors will do. But it is, if you don't do something like that, it is very difficult to make the finances of authorship work if there are no additional ways to earn revenue. And that was, I got a lot of help from the Author's Business Formula, Michael and Tabitha out of Hawaii, a great pair there who helped me through that process. So a shout out to them.
Awesome. And as a final question, Jason, this is probably the most important one and probably the most loaded question. So I'll give context for this, which is I've been doing this show now for about 6-7 years in total, 3 years on YouTube. And I've had the opportunity to meet a wide range of people, from aspiring writers, independent authors, hybrid, traditional historians, whether they are academics, content creators, reenactors, etc. And I've learned a lot from a lot of these people. And I've realized that in this industry, or in any industry, there are usually two paths: to be something and to be known as something. One path is dedicated to the craft, the other is dedicated to the marketing side, the building of the brand. And they both have their own set of obstacles, but they lead to the same path in the sense of the outcome. However, I do want to say that to be known as something is always the most enticing, and unfortunately leads to a lot of unrealistic goals and expectations. And if you are going into the business of being a writer, I'm just going to tell you right now, you're not going to make a lot of money in this industry. It's not a get rich quick scheme. And ultimately, there is no guarantee your first anything is going to be an overnight success or be the start of your legacy. There are exceptions to that rule, of course, but that's what they are, exceptions. Because generally speaking, not everyone's going to be a success overnight. And that can be a hard pill to swallow for many people. So, Jason, the final question is this. With everything you have learned in your 25-year career of numerous jobs, working on numerous products and so forth, how would you tell a client, specifically if they're a writer, that while there is no guarantee if you go into this business, your product is going to be a success, that shouldn't stop you from honing your craft and further refining it if you're truly passionate about this industry that you're going into?
Yeah, I would say that my own perspective, and this is just the evidence I've seen, is that it all starts with kind of the right offer for the right audience, the right book for the right person, the right product for the right buyer. When you get that right, all the other good stuff comes from that. It's the foundation on which everything else is built. I find that what's the old story about a 15-year overnight success? That most of what looks like runaway overnight success is nothing of the sort. That it took years to get to that point of, hard work, refinement, improvement over a long period of time. And then all of a sudden, through luck happens. Basically, the trick is my advice for innovators, my advice for writers is give yourself enough time for luck to happen. Because luck happens when you're doing really good work, you are improving, you're just getting better and better and better all the time. You're better and better and better at meeting your audience. They like it more and more. All of a sudden, some famous person hears about your book from some nobody in Nowheresville, and they pick it up, and it's Oprah's favorite thing, and now you're huge. But that didn't come out of, that didn't happen in the first 30 minutes.
Right.
You need to give yourself that kind of time to continue to improve and continue to make it better. Give yourself enough time for luck to happen to you, because luck is not predictable, but what you do is. You do the right stuff, you're in the game long enough, and the good things happen. You become successful. I've seen it again and again and again. Right product with the right audience, right book, right reader, eventually works. You just need to be in the game long enough. So keep working at it, keep improving, and luck will happen.
Perfectly said, Jason. Perfectly said. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude an amazing interview here on the show. I want to give a huge thank you to Jason Voiovich for making his official debut here on the channel. Jason, thank you so very much. Now, before we leave, where can people find you on social media if they want to reach out? And where can people buy a copy of your latest book?
Yeah, if people want to find me, the easiest place to find me on social media is LinkedIn. I'm a business professional. I'm on Twitter every once in a while, but LinkedIn is better. If you want to find me and you want to get the book, obviously you can go to Amazon, and Amazon will have the paperback, the ebook, and the Audible audiobook if you want that. Those are all available right now. But if you're a creative person, you're an innovator, you're an entrepreneur, and you want to actually connect the dots from these, from the stories to your own idea, go to repeathistory.com/book, and you'll be able to buy the book from me, and I'll be able to give you all kinds of guidebooks and tip sheets and supplies and resources that will help you make the stories real and show you how to do the same sort of things that the innovators in the Great Depression did, kind of follow the same path they did. So if you're that type of person and you want to do that, go to repeathistory.com/book, and you'll be able to get all of that extra stuff. I'll mail you the book for free. It's like $10 and free shipping. So
awesome. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another episode here on the channel. Again, a huge thank you to Jason for making his official debut on the channel. We wish him all the success going into 2025. And as always, viewers and listeners, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. And remember, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And until next time, we will see you in the next video.